I thought the worst thing about returning home from a war zone was an empty house and a pile of mail. Turns out, the worst thing is discovering complete strangers throwing a barbecue party in your backyard, with kids swinging on the tire swing your grandfather built. And when you ask what the hell is going on, they hand you a rental contract signed by your HOA president. That's when you realize you didn't just fight overseas enemies, now you're fighting a suburban Karen who thinks she can steal your house while you're dodging bullets for her freedom. I'm Captain Marcus Sullivan, and this is the story about what happens to me after returning home from a war zone. If you're watching this during your lunch break or while commuting home, drop a comment about the worst HOA story you've heard, because mine's about to get wild. The taxi pulled up to my childhood home in Meadowbrook Heights at 17:30 hours on a Tuesday evening. After 8 months in Afghanistan, I was ready for the simple pleasure of sleeping in my own bed, maybe grilling a burger on the back patio, definitely calling my girlfriend Sarah to plan our reunion dinner. What I wasn't ready for was the smell of grilled food already wafting through the air, the sound of children's laughter echoing from my backyard, and the sight of patio lights strung up where I definitely hadn't left any patio lights. My first thought was that Sarah had planned some kind of surprise welcome home party. My second thought, as I noticed the unfamiliar SUV in my driveway and toys scattered across the front lawn, was that someone had made a very big mistake. I paid the cab driver and grabbed my duffel bag, walking around to the backyard where the sounds were coming from. That's when I saw them, a family of 4 having what looked like the perfect American barbecue. Dad in his cargo shorts manning the grill, Mom setting out potato salad on the patio table my grandfather had built with his own hands, 2 kids taking turns on the tire swing he'd hung from the old oak tree when I was 7. They were using my outdoor furniture, cooking on my grill, living in my space like they belonged there. The teenage daughter was even making videos with her phone, using my childhood swing set as her backdrop. For a moment, I just stood there, wondering if 8 months of deployment had somehow scrambled my brain. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and polite. The dad looked up from the grill, and I could see the exact moment when he registered my military uniform and confused expression. "I think there might be some kind of mistake here. This is my house." The mom immediately went into defensive mode, standing up straighter and crossing her arms. "I'm sorry, but we live here now," she said, with the kind of authority that suggested she'd had this conversation before. "We have a legal rental agreement through the Homeowners Association. We've been here for 3 months. She disappeared into the house and came back with a thick folder, which she handed to me with obvious reluctance. "Everything's completely legal and above board." I opened the folder and felt my stomach drop. There it was, a professional-looking rental agreement, complete with official letterhead, signatures, and a detailed payment schedule. 2-year lease, $2,500 per month, 6 months paid in advance. The document listed my address, described my property in detail, and was signed by someone named Amber Caldwell, president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. "This is impossible," I said, more to myself than to them. "I own this house. I've owned it for 3 years. I inherited it from my mother." The family looked at each other with the kind of confusion that suggested they were just as surprised as I was. "The HOA lady told us the previous owner had moved away permanently," the dad said slowly. "She said the property had been abandoned and needed proper management." That's when I heard the sound of a car door slamming in my driveway. A white BMW had pulled up behind the family's SUV, and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a real estate magazine. Perfect blonde hair and a sleek bob, designer blazer, oversized sunglasses despite the fact that the sun was setting, and a clipboard that she carried like a weapon. She walked around to the backyard with the kind of confident stride that suggested she owned the entire neighborhood. "Oh, wonderful," she said with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "You must be the previous tenant, finally back from your vacation?" Her tone made it clear that she considered my 8-month deployment to Afghanistan roughly equivalent to a weekend in Vegas. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Marcus Sullivan," I said, trying to maintain military courtesy despite the rage building in my chest. "I wasn't on vacation, I was deployed in service to this country, and this isn't a rental property, this is my home." Amber's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "Well, Captain, that's very noble of you, but property can't just sit empty indefinitely. The HOA has a responsibility to maintain property values and ensure community standards." She produced a sheaf of papers from her clipboard with the flourish of a magician pulling rabbits from a hat. "You received multiple violation notices for lawn maintenance, mail accumulation, and security concerns. When there was no response, the HOA exercised its authority under the community covenant to assume temporary management of the property." I looked at the so-called violation notices, each one more ridiculous than the last. Apparently, my grass had grown too long while I was overseas. Apparently, my mailbox had accumulated too much mail while I was serving my country. Apparently, an empty house constituted a security risk that required immediate intervention. "Ma'am, I was deployed," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I was serving in the United States military. I arranged for mail forwarding and lawn service through a property management company." Amber waved her hand dismissively. "That's between you and your management company. The HOA can only work with what we observed, and what we observed was an abandoned property that was bringing down neighborhood values. Everything we've done is completely legal and necessary." The family was watching this exchange with growing discomfort, probably realizing they'd been caught in the middle of something much bigger than a simple rental dispute. I called 911, hoping the police could sort this out quickly. The responding officer was polite but unhelpful. "Sir, this appears to be a civil matter," he said after reviewing Amber's paperwork. "You'll need to contact an attorney and work through the legal system. I can't force anyone to leave a property when they have what appears to be a legitimate rental agreement." Amber's smile grew wider with each word the officer spoke. "Like I said, Captain, everything is completely legal. You're welcome to challenge our actions through the proper channels, but that process typically takes 2 to 3 years. As Amber drove away in her BMW, she rolled down the window and said with the sweetest possible smile, "Don't worry, honey, the legal process only takes 2 to 3 years." She had no idea she'd just declared war on the wrong person. Because while she knew judges and lawyers, I knew someone who outranked them all. I sat in my rental car outside my childhood home, looking at the house where my mother had raised me after my father died in Iraq. The house where I'd learned to ride a bike and throw a baseball and dream about serving my country. I thought about the promise I'd made to my mother on her deathbed, that I'd keep the house in the family, that I'd honor the legacy of service that had been passed down through 3 generations. Amber Caldwell had just picked a fight with the wrong soldier. I checked into the Hampton Inn down the highway and immediately switched into mission planning mode. 8 months of coordinating airstrikes and managing supply lines in a war zone had taught me the value of thorough reconnaissance before taking action. I opened my laptop and started researching Amber Caldwell, HOA president of Meadowbrook Heights. Her social media accounts painted a picture of suburban affluence, expensive vacations, designer handbags, real estate awards, and endless photos of herself at ribbon cuttings and charity galas. She'd been elected HOA president just 1 year ago, running on a platform of maintaining community standards and protecting property values. The more I dug, the more I realized this might not be her first rodeo. I walked the neighborhood that evening, trying to clear my head and get a feel for the community I'd been away from for 8 months. That's when I met Mrs. Edith Harper, a 70-year-old retired teacher who'd lived on Maple Street for 20 years. She approached me as I stood looking at my house from across the street, probably drawn by the obvious distress written across my face. "I saw what happened today, dear," she said gently. "I'm so sorry about what Amber did to your family home. She did the same thing to Mr. Peterson down the street last year." Mrs. Harper's revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. "The same thing?" I asked. "You mean this has happened before?" Mrs. Harper nodded sadly and invited me to sit on her front porch, where she proceeded to tell me a story that made my blood boil. Harold Peterson, an 82-year-old Korean War veteran, had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years. When he'd moved to assisted living 6 months earlier, Amber had immediately declared his house abandoned and arranged for it to be rented out through the same process she'd used on my property. Harold tried to fight it from the nursing home, Mrs. Harper explained, but he was old and sick and didn't have the energy for a legal battle. He ended up selling the house for way below market value just to get out from under the legal fees. He died 3 months later, and his son still believes the stress of losing the family home contributed to his decline. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was far more sinister than I'd initially realized. Amber wasn't just power-hungry. She was systematically targeting properties whose owners might be vulnerable or unable to fight back. Military families during deployment, elderly residents in assisted living, anyone who might not be around to immediately challenge her authority. I tried to ask questions about the HOA finances at board meetings, Mrs. Harper continued, but Amber shut me down every time. When I persisted, she organized a vote to remove me from the board, said I was being disruptive and undermining community harmony. She disappeared into her house and came back with a banker's box full of documents. I've been keeping my own records of everything she's done. Someone needed to document it all. I called my commanding officer that evening. Colonel James Mitchell had been my mentor since I'd joined the Air Force 7 years earlier, and he'd always told his airmen that they could come to him with any problem, military or civilian. "Sir, I need some advice on a civilian legal matter," I said when he answered his phone. "It's related to my housing situation." There was immediate concern in his voice as I explained what had happened. Colonel Mitchell was a 25-year veteran who'd risen through the ranks from enlisted man to wing commander, and he had zero patience for people who took advantage of military families. "Son, what you're describing sounds like a systematic targeting of deployed service members. That's not just wrong, it's potentially illegal under federal law." The next morning, I requested a meeting with the HOA board to discuss the situation formally. Amber agreed to meet at the community center, probably confident that she could intimidate me with official procedures and legal-sounding language. She showed up with one nervous-looking board member and immediately went into full corporate mode. "Captain Sullivan, we appreciate your service to our country, but we have to follow established procedures regardless of the circumstances," she said, spreading papers across the conference table like she was conducting a business merger. "The property management situation can be resolved, but will require payment of outstanding fees and penalties totaling $20,000, plus administrative costs." $20,000 for what amounted to lawn violations and accumulated mail while I was serving my country in a war zone. Amber continued with the kind of smooth professionalism that suggested she'd given this speech before. "Military families should really plan better before taking overseas assignments," she said with fake sympathy. "These deployments create obvious challenges for property maintenance, and the HOA can't make exceptions just because someone chooses a career that takes them away from their responsibilities." The casual cruelty of that statement, the dismissive way she characterized my military service as a career choice, that created inconvenience for her, finally broke through my military discipline. "Ma'am," I said, standing up slowly and letting my full 6'2" frame tower over the conference table, "you just made a serious mistake." "You soldiers think the world revolves around you," she shot back, her professional facade slipping for the first time. "Maybe next time, don't sign up for a job that takes you away from your responsibilities. The world doesn't stop turning just because you decided to play hero overseas." Mrs. Harper, who'd been quietly taking notes in the corner, reached over and squeezed my arm gently. "That girl has no idea what she just started," she whispered. She was right. Amber had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That evening, I called Colonel Mitchell again and gave him a full briefing on the situation. His response was immediate and decisive. "Pack your bags, son. You're staying in base quarters tonight. And Marcus, don't do anything yet. Reinforcements arrive at 0800. After I hung up, Mrs. Harper knocked on my hotel room door with another box of documents. "I've been keeping records of Amber's activities for 18 months, she said. "Bank statements, recorded phone calls, email exchanges, meeting minutes. Someone needs to stop her before she destroys more families." She handed me a manila folder and said quietly, "Tomorrow when your colonel arrives, show him these. Because what Amber did to you and Harold Peterson, she's planning to do to 3 more families this summer." The realization settled in my stomach like a cold stone. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a business model. At exactly 0800 hours, a black government sedan pulled up outside my house. Colonel James Mitchell stepped out in full-dress uniform, his ribbons and command pilot wings gleaming in the morning sun. At 53, he cut an impressive figure, 6 feet tall, silver hair, and a perfect military cut, and the kind of bearing that made it obvious he'd spent his life in positions of authority. Neighbors started appearing at windows and front porches, drawn by the unmistakable presence of high-ranking military brass in their suburban neighborhood. Mrs. Harper watched from her porch with barely concealed satisfaction, probably anticipating the confrontation that was about to unfold. The colonel walked directly to the HOA office in the community center, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement with military precision. I followed at a respectful distance, my heart pounding with anticipation and no small amount of fear. Colonel Mitchell didn't just command a wing, he commanded respect from everyone who met him, and I'd never seen him truly angry. When he knocked on Amber's office door, it was with the kind of measured authority that suggested he was used to having doors opened immediately. "Ma'am, I'm Colonel Mitchell. We need to discuss my airman's property." Amber looked up from her desk with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she dealt with difficult people every day. "I'm sorry, but I don't discuss confidential HOA. I'm not a stranger, ma'am. I'm Captain Sullivan's commanding officer, and I'm here in my official capacity as wing commander." The colonel's voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely terrifying in its calm authority. He placed Mrs. Harper's folder of documents on Amber's desk, with the precision of a chess master making a killing move. These documents suggest a pattern of targeting military families during deployment periods, I'd like to understand the HOA's policy regarding service members' rights under federal law. Amber glanced at the papers with obvious discomfort, probably recognizing Mrs. Harper's meticulous handwriting and realizing that someone had been documenting her activities in detail. Everything the HOA has done is according to established community covenants, Amber said, her professional mask slipping slightly. We don't make exceptions based on people's employment situations, military or otherwise. Property maintenance is the responsibility of the owner, regardless of where their job takes them. Colonel Mitchell nodded slowly, and I could see him cataloging every word for future reference. I see. And what about Harold Peterson's case, 82-year-old Korean War veteran who lost his family home through similar circumstances? The color drained from Amber's face as she realized the scope of what we knew. Mr. Peterson's situation was handled according to HOA procedures. His family was free to contest our actions through legal channels. His son contacted our base chaplain, asking for an investigation into the circumstances surrounding his father's death, Colonel Mitchell continued, with the relentless precision of a prosecutor building a case. Harold Peterson died in a nursing home after losing the house he'd lived in for 40 years. His son believes the stress of the legal battle contributed to his father's decline. Amber was fidgeting now, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. I'm sorry for Mr. Peterson's family's loss. But the HOA had a responsibility to maintain community standards. We can't let personal situations override established procedures. That was her second mistake. Her first had been targeting a deployed soldier. Her second was doubling down when offered a chance to make things right. Ma'am, you're absolutely correct that this is America, not a military state, Colonel Mitchell said with dangerous quiet. But it's also a country that protects the rights of those who serve it. What you've described suggests a systematic violation of federal laws designed to protect military families. He pulled out his phone and made a call right there in front of her. This is Colonel Mitchell. I need public affairs here immediately. Story angle. Local HOA systematically targeting deployed military families. Timeline, 30 minutes. Amber's eyes went wide as she realized this wasn't going to be a private conversation anymore. You can't just call the media on a private citizen. Ma'am, the moment you made this about military families, you made it about national security and public interest, the colonel replied calmly. The public has a right to know when their service members are being targeted by local organizations. Word was already spreading through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. By the time the local news van arrived, 43 neighbors had gathered outside the community center, many of them holding coffee cups and wearing the kind of expressions that suggested they'd been waiting for this moment for months. Mrs. Harper had positioned herself strategically near the front of the crowd, her box of evidence at the ready. The reporter from Channel 7 immediately recognized the human interest goldmine that had just fallen into her lap. Colonel, can you tell us about the allegations against the Meadowbrook Heights HOA? Colonel Mitchell's response was measured, professional, and absolutely devastating. We're investigating reports that this homeowners association has systematically targeted military families during deployment periods, potentially violating federal laws designed to protect service members' housing rights. Amber attempted to slip out the back entrance of the community center, but someone had already started live streaming the confrontation, and her escape attempt was caught on multiple phones. The crowd was growing by the minute, and the mood was shifting from curiosity to anger as neighbors began sharing their own stories about Amber's heavy-handed tactics. Someone mentioned the elderly woman who'd been fined $500 for having the wrong color mailbox. Someone else brought up the young military wife who'd been intimidated into paying bogus fees while her husband was overseas. The pattern was becoming clear to everyone. Amber had been using the HOA as her personal kingdom, targeting anyone she perceived as vulnerable or unable to fight back. As the news camera rolled, Colonel Mitchell looked directly at Amber and said with a voice that could command armies, "Ma'am, you have until tomorrow morning to return my soldiers' house keys, or I demonstrate what full military support actually looks like." Amber's face went pale as she realized she wasn't fighting a soldier anymore. She was fighting the United States Air Force. The crowd began to applaud, and I felt something I hadn't experienced since my first combat mission, the absolute certainty that I was on the right side of a fight that mattered. Mrs. Harper caught my eye from across the crowd and gave me a thumbs up that looked suspiciously like a victory salute. Amber spent a sleepless night making frantic phone calls to every lawyer in the county, but the advice was unanimous. Don't fight the military on this one. Every attorney she contacted gave her the same counsel. Apologize, make restitution, and hope the story doesn't go national. But Amber's pride and her conviction that she was legally in the right prevented her from taking the smart path. Instead, she decided to double down, probably believing that her knowledge of local politics and HOA law would somehow triumph over federal authority and mounting community pressure. Mrs. Harper organized an informal neighborhood meeting for the next evening, posting flyers and making phone calls with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 40 years managing high school students. Instead of the usual 6 people who attended HOA meetings, over 40 residents packed into the community center, many bringing their own documentation of Amber's heavy-handed tactics. The energy in the room was electric, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Parents brought printouts of excessive fines, elderly residents shared stories of intimidation, and multiple military families described harassment while their spouses were deployed overseas. "I have 18 months of financial records that tell a very interesting story," Mrs. Harper announced, standing at the front of the room with her banker's box of evidence. Bank statements showing rental payments going to personal accounts, meeting minutes documenting target selection, and recorded phone calls where certain residents are discussed as management opportunities. She began pulling out documents with the systematic precision of a prosecutor building a case. Amber Caldwell has collected over $50,000 in rental fees that never made it into community accounts. Instead, they went directly to fund her personal lifestyle, while our community pool stayed broken and our playground equipment rusted. Other victims began stepping forward with their own stories. A young military wife described being threatened with legal action while her husband was deployed to South Korea. An elderly couple shared documentation of ridiculous fines: $200 for having one too many garden gnomes, $300 for a mailbox that was allegedly the wrong shade of black, $500 for a Christmas wreath that stayed up 2 days past the arbitrary HOA deadline. The pattern was clear. Amber had been systematically targeting anyone she perceived as vulnerable, using the HOA as her personal money-making scheme. Amber arrived at what she'd assumed would be a routine board meeting to find a room full of angry residents, multiple cameras, and Mrs. Harper standing at the front with enough evidence to bury her. "This is a private HOA meeting," she announced, trying to regain control of the situation. "Non-board members need to leave immediately." The response was immediate and unanimous. Laughter. Not polite chuckles, but the kind of derisive laughter reserved for people who've overestimated their own authority. "Actually, Amber," said Tom Richardson, a retired police officer who lived on Oak Street, "this is a community meeting to discuss your removal from office." Colonel Mitchell entered the room in dress uniform and took a position near the back, saying nothing but making his presence unmistakably known. The crowd parted respectfully to let him pass, and several veterans in the room stood at attention out of habit. Amber's confidence visibly wavered as she realized the full scope of what she was facing. "You can't just remove me from office because you don't like my management style," she said, her voice rising with desperation. "I was elected according to HOA procedures, and I've followed all established protocols." Mrs. Harper smiled with the kind of patience she'd perfected during decades of dealing with difficult teenagers. "Actually, dear, we can remove you for cause, and we have plenty of cause." The confrontation escalated quickly as Amber completely lost her composure. "You people don't understand the authority of this office," she shouted, her professional facade cracking like a broken dam. "These properties need proper management, and I'm the only one with the expertise to provide it." The inadvertent admission sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the crowd. She'd just confessed to treating private homes as business opportunities that required her personal intervention. "I've worked too hard building this organization to let a bunch of She gestured wildly at the crowd, clearly searching for words that wouldn't make her situation worse. The room erupted in calls for an immediate vote of no confidence. Mrs. Harper was nominated as interim president by acclamation, with several voices shouting, "All in favor," before the nomination was even properly seconded. Amber was officially stripped of her position by a voice vote so unanimous it sounded like a military response to a commanding officer. Security had to be called to escort her from the building, as she continued shouting about lawsuits and property rights, and how everyone would regret crossing her. The local news crew had been filming everything, and the footage of Amber's meltdown was already being shared across social media platforms. Hashtags like "Justice for Deployed Heroes" and "HOA Abuse" began trending locally, and the story was picked up by veteran organizations nationwide. By morning, Amber had become the poster child for HOA overreach, and my personal fight had transformed into something much larger. As the crowd dispersed that evening, Mrs. Harper pulled me aside with tears in her eyes. "Harold Peterson would be so proud," she said. "His sacrifice finally meant something." But as Amber was escorted from the building, she turned to me with pure venom and hissed, "This isn't over. I'll make sure you never feel safe in that house again." Mrs. Harper squeezed my arm and whispered, "Oh, honey, she just made the biggest mistake of her life, because now it's personal for all of us. The transformation was immediate and decisive. Mrs. Harper was officially sworn in as HOA president at an emergency board meeting, with her first official act being the return of my house keys and the declaration that Amber's management contract was null and void. The rental family was incredibly understanding about the situation, especially after learning they'd been unwitting participants in a scam that had targeted military families. The neighborhood rallied to help them find temporary housing while they sorted out their living situation, with several families offering guest rooms and Mrs. Harper coordinating a fund to cover their moving expenses. Walking through my childhood home for the first time in 8 months was an emotional experience I wasn't prepared for. Everything was exactly where my mother had left it. Her reading glasses still on the kitchen counter, her favorite coffee mug in the dish drainer, family photos arranged precisely the way she'd positioned them before cancer took her 2 years earlier. The rental family had been respectful of our belongings, storing everything carefully and maintaining the house with obvious care. Colonel Mitchell helped me restore the family photos to their proper places on the walls, and Mrs. Harper appeared at the door with fresh chocolate chip cookies, still warm from the oven. The financial investigation moved quickly once Mrs. Harper's meticulous records were turned over to the authorities. Her documentation revealed a systematic pattern of fraud that went far beyond my case. Over $50,000 in rental payments had been diverted to Amber's personal accounts, while the community pool remained broken, playground equipment rusted, and basic maintenance was deferred. Bank statements showed luxury purchases, expensive vacations, and designer clothes funded by money that should have gone to community improvements. The math was simple enough that even a jury would understand. Amber had been stealing from her own neighbors. The district attorney's office moved with unusual speed, probably motivated by the media attention and the involvement of military families. Criminal charges were filed for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit theft. Amber's real estate license was suspended pending investigation, her assets were frozen to ensure restitution could be paid, and her husband filed for legal separation to protect himself from the financial fallout. The house she'd been so proud of was quietly listed for sale, at a price that suggested serious financial distress. Meanwhile, the community began healing in ways that surprised everyone. A neighborhood fund was established to help families who'd been victimized by Amber's schemes, with Mr. Peterson's son receiving a settlement that helped pay for his father's final medical bills. New HOA bylaws were written to prevent future targeting of vulnerable residents, with specific protections for military families during deployment periods. An annual military appreciation event was planned, with Mrs. Harper suggesting we hold it in my backyard as a symbol of community resilience. The media attention continued to grow, with the story being picked up by national military news networks and veteran advocacy organizations. The Pentagon issued an official statement supporting the affected families and praising the community's response. Celebrity veterans began sharing the story on social media, and my personal fight became a rallying cry for military families nationwide. Amber, meanwhile, had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked HOA authority and the importance of community oversight. My mother's garden, which had been my biggest concern during deployment, was restored to its former glory by volunteers from throughout the neighborhood. Mrs. Harper brought her master gardener expertise, Colonel Mitchell surprised everyone by revealing a talent for landscaping, and even some of the teenagers from the high school showed up to help plant new flowers. The tire swing that had been the center of the BBQ controversy was reinforced and painted, ready for the next generation of neighborhood children to enjoy. Personal vindication felt different than I'd expected. Instead of satisfaction at Amber's downfall, I found myself grateful for the community that had rallied around a soldier in need. Colonel Mitchell's family invited me for dinner regularly, treating me like the son they'd never had. Mrs. Harper became the grandmother I'd lost when my mother died, always ready with advice, cookies, and the kind of unconditional support that military families treasure. The experience had taught me something important about service. Protecting your community is just as important as protecting your country. The legal resolution came faster than anyone expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence and mounting legal costs, Amber pleaded guilty to avoid a trial that would have destroyed what remained of her reputation. The court ordered full restitution to all victims, 18 months of house arrest with community service, and a lifetime ban from serving on any homeowners association board. She was also required to perform her community service at the local Veterans Center, a piece of poetic justice that Mrs. Harper had suggested to the prosecutor. The day I received the official paperwork declaring my property fully restored was also the day Mrs. Harper knocked on my door with a newspaper and the biggest smile I'd ever seen. "Dear, you need to see the front page," she said, practically bouncing with excitement. The headline read, "Local Hero Inspires State Military Protection Law," with a photo of me shaking hands with the governor as he signed legislation that would protect deployed service members from similar situations statewide. My personal fight had become something much bigger than I'd ever imagined possible. The invitation to testify before the state legislature came 3 weeks after Amber's sentencing. Standing at the podium in the state capitol, looking out at representatives from across the state, I realized my story had touched something deeper than individual injustice. The Military Family Protection Act was introduced with bipartisan support, designed to prevent HOAs from targeting deployed service members and their families. My testimony, combined with Mrs. Harper's documentation and Colonel Mitchell's official statement, provided the foundation for legislation that would protect thousands of military families. The governor signed the bill into law with me standing beside him, and the photo made front pages across the region. Military Times ran a cover story about the case, and I found myself fielding speaking requests from veteran organizations, military bases, and community groups. What had started as a personal property dispute had evolved into a national conversation about HOA accountability and military family rights. Mrs. Harper joked that she'd created a monster, but I could see the pride in her eyes every time someone mentioned the Meadowbrook Heights model for community governance. Amber's fall from grace was swift and comprehensive. Her sentencing included mandatory community service at the Veterans Center, where she was required to help the very families she'd previously targeted. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially the veterans who remembered Harold Peterson's story. Her social media accounts were deleted, her real estate career was over, and she'd become a social pariah in the community she'd once dominated. The financial ruin was complete. Legal fees, restitution payments, and the fire sale of her house left her essentially starting over from nothing. The community transformation was remarkable to witness. Property values actually increased due to the positive media attention and the new reputation for standing up against injustice. New military families were actively recruited to the neighborhood, with Mrs. Harper personally welcoming each one with cookies and detailed orientation packets. The annual military appreciation events became legendary, drawing attendees from neighboring communities and featuring everything from honor guard ceremonies to children's activities. My backyard became the traditional venue, a symbol of how community support can overcome individual malice. 1 year after the whole ordeal began, I found myself planning a wedding in the same backyard where strangers had once held unauthorized barbecues. Sarah, my girlfriend who'd supported me through the entire legal battle, had accepted my proposal during a quiet moment in my mother's restored garden. Colonel Mitchell agreed to officiate the ceremony in his dress uniform, and Mrs. Harper appointed herself wedding coordinator with the efficiency of a military quartermaster. The guest list included neighbors, military colleagues, and veteran advocates from across the country who'd followed our story. The Patterson Foundation Scholarship Fund, named in honor of Harold Peterson, had grown beyond anything we'd originally envisioned. Funded by donations from veteran organizations and supported by the community, it provided college scholarships for children of deployed military families. Mrs. Harper managed the foundation with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd applied to documenting Amber's crimes, ensuring every dollar went directly to supporting military families in need. My advocacy work had become a second career, with speaking engagements at military bases and veteran conferences. The Pentagon invited me to participate in policy discussions about military family support, and I worked with Colonel Mitchell to establish legal resources for service members facing similar situations. Every week brought new emails from military families dealing with HOA harassment, property disputes, or other challenges related to deployment. The network we'd built around my personal case had become a national resource for military families in crisis. The legislative impact spread beyond our state, as other governments adopted similar protections for military families. Congressional hearings examined HOA oversight and accountability, with my case serving as a primary example of how local organizations could abuse their authority. Thousands of military families were now protected by laws that traced their origin to Amber's overreach and Mrs. Harper's meticulous documentation of her crimes. Looking back, the most surprising aspect of the entire experience was how it had brought out the best in people. Neighbors who'd barely spoken before became close friends. Military families found stronger community connections. Mrs. Harper discovered a new purpose in protecting others from the kind of abuse she'd witnessed. Even some of the teenagers in the neighborhood had been inspired to consider military service or community activism by seeing how ordinary people could stand up against injustice and create meaningful change. The final piece of poetic justice came when Amber completed her community service at the Veterans Center. The director, a Vietnam veteran named Frank Rodriguez, reported that she'd actually become one of their most reliable volunteers. Whether this represented genuine redemption or simply the desire to complete her sentence was unclear, but the fact remained that she was now helping the very community she'd once targeted. As Mrs. Harper observed, sometimes the best punishment is forcing someone to see the humanity in the people they've hurt. As I sat in my mother's garden one evening reading letters from military families we'd helped, I realized that Amber's attempt to steal my house had ultimately given me something far more valuable: a purpose beyond military service, and a community that felt like family. The house my grandfather built and my mother had left me was no longer just a building. It had become a symbol of what's possible when good people refuse to let bullies win. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, with late spring sunshine filtering through the oak tree where my grandfather had hung the tire swing 40 years earlier. Colonel Mitchell looked magnificent in his dress uniform as he waited at the makeshift altar Mrs. Harper had constructed with military precision and grandmother's love. The same backyard that had been the center of controversy 18 months earlier was now filled with friends, family, and neighbors celebrating something beautiful, built from the ashes of conflict. Sarah walked down the aisle between rows of folding chairs occupied by an unlikely mix of military personnel, neighborhood families, veteran advocates, and even some of the teenagers who'd helped restore my mother's garden. Mrs. Harper sat in the front row, wearing her best dress, and the kind of smile that suggested she was claiming full credit for orchestrating this perfect day. The rental family who'd been caught in the middle of the original dispute had been invited as honored guests, their children excited to play on the swing set that had inadvertently started everything. Colonel Mitchell's ceremony was both military and deeply personal, incorporating traditions from my Air Force service and readings from my mother's favorite poems. When he pronounced us husband and wife, the applause was thunderous, led by Mrs. Harper's enthusiastic cheering and joined by neighbors who'd become family through shared struggle. The reception was a community affair, with everyone contributing something. Mrs. Chen brought her famous spring rolls, the Rodriguez family provided their legendary barbacoa, and Mrs. Harper had somehow coordinated a dessert table that looked like something from a professional catering company. As the evening wore on and guests mingled throughout the garden, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. Amber's house across the street displayed a sold sign, with a young military couple scheduled to move in next week. Mrs. Harper had already introduced herself to them during their house hunting visit, armed with cookies and detailed information about neighborhood amenities. The cycle was continuing, but now with protection and support systems that hadn't existed before. The community had transformed in ways that went far beyond my personal situation. Children played safely in yards where parents no longer feared arbitrary fines or harassment. Military families felt welcomed and supported, rather than targeted and vulnerable. Mrs. Harper had established monthly potluck dinners that brought neighbors together, creating the kind of close-knit community that developers promise but rarely deliver. The annual military appreciation events had become so popular that they drew visitors from neighboring towns, with local businesses sponsoring activities and politicians making appearances. The Patterson Foundation had awarded its first scholarships at a ceremony that brought tears to everyone's eyes, including Harold Peterson's son, who'd traveled from Arizona to see his father's memory honored through support for other military families. Mrs. Harper read letters from scholarship recipients, young people who were able to attend college because their parents' military service was valued and supported by their community. The foundation had grown beyond our wildest dreams, funded by donations from across the country and managed with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. As the wedding reception continued around us, Sarah and I stole a quiet moment in my mother's rose garden, the spot where I'd scattered her ashes 2 years earlier. She would have loved this, Sarah said, referring to the celebration of community and love surrounding us. She would have loved how you turned something terrible into something beautiful. I thought about my mother's final words, her request that I keep the house and the family, and realized I'd done something even better. I'd made the entire neighborhood feel like family. The legislative legacy continued to expand, with the Military Family Protection Act serving as a model for similar laws in other states. Congressional representatives had invited me to testify about HOA reform and military family rights, transforming a personal property dispute into national policy discussions. The Pentagon had adopted new guidelines for helping deployed service members protect their property rights, and military legal assistance offices now used our case as a training example for helping families prevent similar problems. Amber made one final appearance in our story, driving slowly past the wedding reception on her way to her community service shift at the Veterans Center. She had completed 18 months of house arrest and community service, paying full restitution to all her victims, and rebuilding her life in a modest apartment across town. Whether she'd learned genuine empathy or simply served her sentence was debatable, but the fact remained that she was now contributing to the community she'd once exploited. Mrs. Harper, ever the optimist, insisted that even broken people could be fixed with enough time and appropriate consequences. The evening wound down with neighbors helping clean up and children falling asleep in their parents' arms after hours of playing in the yard where everything had started. Colonel Mitchell's family had become my chosen family, with regular Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations that filled the house with laughter and love. Mrs. Harper had become the grandmother I'd lost when my mother died, always ready with advice, encouragement, and enough cookies to feed a small army. The military couples in the neighborhood formed a support network that ensured no family would face deployment challenges alone. As Sarah and I sat on the porch swing that neighbors had given us as a wedding gift, watching the last guests say their goodbyes, I received a text message that reminded me why this work mattered. A young airman stationed in Germany was facing a similar situation with his HOA, and his wife had found our story online. They needed help navigating the system and understanding their rights. I smiled and reached for my phone, ready to make the calls that would protect another military family from predators like Amber. Looking across the street at Amber's former house, now showing signs of new life with children's toys in the yard and an American flag by the front door, I realized that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened. Amber had thought she could steal a soldier's house while he defended her freedom. Instead, she'd accidentally created the strongest military community in 3 counties, inspired national legislation protecting deployed families, and reminded an entire neighborhood what happens when good people stand together against bullying. And me? I got more than my house back. I got a reminder of why we serve, to protect the idea that home is sacred, and those who defend it deserve nothing less than absolute respect from the community they protect. If you know a military family dealing with a similar situation, don't wait for someone else to help. Be there, Mrs. Harper. Be their supportive neighbor. Be there, Colonel Mitchell, because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and an entire community ready to stand together. Home isn't just where you live. It's where people fight for you when you can't fight for yourself.